when one is involved with the international economy and economic development, you can't stay away from geopolitics. Geopolitics, domestic politics, international markets, and domestic markets are all completely intertwined in any country. You can't think about the US or Australia or any country in Africa today, or Ukraine or Russia, without considering both the economics and the geopolitics. And so, as I come at this as an economist, I have advised governments all over the world, dozens and dozens of heads of state and governments on particular issues. But in the case of Russia and Ukraine, I go back to the late 1980s when I was really, in fact, somewhat for accidental reasons, maybe the main outside advisor in the Central and Eastern European countries starting in 1989 in their transformation from the Soviet period to the democratization and market reform period, and then to eventual membership in the European Union. And that was in 1989 that I played a pretty central role in Poland's transformation, and in several other countries in the region because of that. I was asked in 1990 to become an economic advisor to the team of economists advising President Mikhail Gorbachev. And so I became quite involved in the discussions of the Soviet reforms at the end of the Soviet period. Then when Gorbachev lost power and Yeltsin came to power, I was asked by President Yeltsin's economic team to advise President Yeltsin. I sat in the Kremlin in December 1991 with Boris Yeltsin immediately across from me to hear President Yeltsin say, "I announce the end of the Soviet Union," because it had just happened in a meeting in the next room that preceded the meeting that I and a group of economists was to have with President Yeltsin. So I heard that directly. I became an advisor to the second president of independent Ukraine, President Leonid Kuchma, in 1993-94. All of this is to say my firsthand experience in this region goes back now 36 years of pretty intense experience. And then in one way or another, I remained involved in the debates and the discussions of politics, geopolitics, economics throughout the years. When the Maidan coup occurred in February 2014, or the Maidan Revolution, depending on whose narrative you follow. But in any event, when that occurred, I was called almost immediately by the new Ukrainian government, by the prime minister, to come meet with him to talk about the economic crisis. So I was in Ukraine just after the Maidan, and I heard an earful about what had happened, how it had happened. I saw with my own eyes. I was invited to Ukraine in 2019 to meet with the new president, Mr. Zelensky. So I was at the lunch table with him and a delegation. I spoke to U.S. leaders in 2021, urging them to avoid the dramatic escalation that came with Russia's invasion in February 24, 2022. And I gave them good advice on how to avoid that war, and they rejected my advice. I advised the governments to settle quickly in the early months of 2022 in what became known as the Istanbul process, because Ukraine and Russia actually negotiated with Turkish mediators in Istanbul in March and April. The United States stopped those negotiations. Shockingly, probably 1 million Ukrainians have died or been wounded since the U.S. told the Ukrainians, "You don't have to do that. Keep fighting. You're on our side. You don't have to declare neutrality," which was the core of the agreement that they were about to sign in April 2022. So when you ask, how do I get involved? Well, I am an economist. I'm a specialist on budgets, monetary policy, fiscal policy, debt management, issues like that. But in that process, you advise governments, you observe politics, you have to be involved in negotiating international agreements, say with the IMF or the World Bank, or debt restructuring agreements. Boy, that's politics. So there's no sharp dividing line between those.
Well, it's funny you should say that. And I think that from my many years here operating in a sort of semi-political role here in Australia, trying to get people to understand the unification of hard security, politics, and economics has always been, what do we say, a bit noir. No one listens to me. It's like, no, no, they're all different, they're all separate, you know. But anyway, that's
Well,
that's
let
that's a
me
discussion.
officially say to your listeners, listen,
Yeah. Oh,
because
thank
this
you,
is
thank you.
this is exactly right. These are all interconnected.
Yeah.
So many games, by the way, so much maneuvering.
Mm.
Uh, who gets to trade? What principles? Who gets the loans? Who doesn't get the loans? Which
Yeah.
companies come in? This is politics. It's not just markets and uh,
Mm.
perfect competition, as one would hear in a first year economics textbook. This is
Mm.
a pretty interlocked political, geopolitical, and economic system.
Oh, absolutely. Critics in the Atlanticist security community, however, argue that you and John Mearsheimer echo Putin's justifications for Russia's actions, often placing the blame on the US and NATO. As an American, what led you to this position? I mean, you gave an indication earlier, but you know, I think for people who are in our audience who may have not heard your position, they probably would like to know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, first of all, that charge is correct in one sense. I think that uh, the way that the Russians explain this crisis is more accurate than the way that the Americans explain this crisis, just straight out. Of course, there are games of narrative, but I come from a country that lies for a living. The governments lie for a living. All my life, the United States government has lied. It lied about Vietnam. It lied about Iraq. It lied about Syria. It lied about countless things. And one of the things it's lied about is its behavior vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and Russia from 1990 onward. I've seen it with my own eyes. So there's a difference between uh, agreeing with something that President Putin says and being an apologist or being in his pocket or being on his pay. I'm not on anybody's pay, believe me. This has nothing to do with some kind of ulterior interest. Uh, I depend for my livelihood on being as accurate as possible. Let me put it that way. My words come back to be quoted to me 20 years later, 30 years later. So I'm very careful about what I say, why I say it, what the evidence is, and so forth. This is not a game. It's not a business. It happens that I believe that the Russian uh, position on this is more accurate. Now, here's the story. The story is that when I worked for Gorbachev, I actually believed that the Western world should help President Gorbachev to stabilize and transform the Soviet economy, which was a failure as an economy, and it needed to become a mixed market economy. And it was also in a deep financial crisis. And I have expertise in designing ways out of financial crises. That was my specialty for years and years with a lot of successes. And I recommended that the U.S. help. And the answer from the U.S. government was, hell no, we're not going to help them. They're the enemies. I said, Gorbachev's not the enemy. A soft landing, a help with transformation will be good for world peace. They were not interested in that. They were interested in U.S. dominance, in U.S. primacy, in the U.S. becoming the most powerful country in the world. The view from the Russian side or the Soviet side is the Cold War is over. Let's become normal and have good relations. The view from the American side was we won, you lost, we run the show. Basically, it's as simple as that. And it's true, it's as simple as that. And I lived through that for 35 years. American arrogance. America as the indispensable country. America as the only country that counts. America that doesn't have to listen to a word of Russian concerns, and so on. Well, there's a lot to say, and I could spend hours with you on what happened, but basically, three things happened. When the Soviet Union was ending, the United States promised no NATO enlargement. This was February 7th, 1990. Explicit. It happened to be repeated countless times, by the way. But the idea was that the United States and Germany said, let us end World War II with German reunification, and we, the West, will not take advantage of you, the Soviet Union, as Germany reunifies, and as you, President Gorbachev, end the Warsaw Pact military alliance. Essentially, the US cheated on that as soon as it could. So the basic story from 1991 onward is, oh, Soviet Union lost, now we do what we want, including NATO enlargement. And not just NATO enlargement to Central Europe, to Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic, but all the way to Ukraine. And by the way, not all the way to Ukraine only, but all the way to Georgia. People should take out a map and look at Georgia. NATO, the North Atlantic Defense Organization in Georgia, in the Southern Caucasus. Are you kidding? But of course, the idea was from 1991 onward that the United States would dominate. Dominate. Many words given for that: liberal hegemony, primacy, full spectrum dominance, indispensable country, world leader, whatever you want. Such arrogance for a country of 4.1% of the world population. Now, I have to say, since we're all Anglo-Saxons here, you know, everything the United States learned, they learned from the British. The British actually are the most arrogant, it's the most arrogant country in the whole world in modern history. And the US took that on, the baton from Churchill to Truman in 1945, and that was the view. But from 45 to 91, there was the pesky fact of the Soviet Union. Starting after 1991, to the American eyes, as far as the eye could see, no conceivable rival. China, by the way, was not on anybody's radar screen. It was a bunch of rice-growing villages as far as the Americans were concerned. It was nowhere to be seen. Russia was a gas station with nuclear weapons, as the quip, so-called quip, went in the 1990s and the 2000s. So the US was so full of itself. Now, that meant three kinds of foreign policies that I think are really important to understand very briefly. One was NATO enlargement. If anybody played the board game Risk, you want your piece on every piece of the board. And that's what the US wanted for 30 years with its military, a base every place on the board. It wants it in Australia. It wants nuclear submarines in Australia. What, for God's sake? Are we kidding? It wants it everywhere around the Chinese Rim. It wants it in Central Asia. It wants it in Africa. It wants it in the Middle East, and so on and so on and so on. So number one was put your military piece on every part of the board, including NATO enlargement, contrary to promise. Second was regime change. American foreign policy is based on a simple idea, unique of all statecraft in the world to the United States, which is, if you don't like your counterpart, change their government. You know, most other countries can't do this. If Australia says, we don't like New Zealand, you don't change the government, or we don't like the way the Japanese are, you don't change the government. You have to do diplomacy somehow. You have to engage. You have to figure out how to maneuver. But the United States view is, you don't like the government, change it. And we do covert regime change operations for a living, dozens and dozens and dozens of them. And I've seen them with my own eyes. Presidents carried away by the CIA, by the way, coups, color revolutions. Anyway, that's the second. The third was to abandon the nuclear arms control framework, probably the least discussed and most consequential of all. In 2002, the United States unilaterally abandoned the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. I think this was the single most destabilizing event in 30 years between the US and Russia. All of a sudden, the US is putting anti-ballistic missile systems in Eastern and Central Europe. And the Russians are saying, oh, that's nice. What are in those silos? Nuclear weapons? Well, maybe not. Decapitation strike? Who knows? But they're coming closer and closer to Moscow, and there's a real possibility that they'll be in Ukraine as soon as we know it. So these were the three features of U.S. arrogance: NATO enlargement and similar enlargement of military bases of the United States in the Indian Ocean, South China Sea, the first island chain, and all the rest. That's number one. Number two, regime change operations. And number three, breaking the nuclear stability. By the way, in 2017, Trump walked out of another nuclear agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action vis-a-vis Iran. In 2019, he walked out of another nuclear agreement, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement. This is very little talked about, but it weighs extremely heavily in geopolitics, because nuclear arms between the two nuclear superpowers with the biggest arsenals matters profoundly. And this destabilized the relations, and many events happened. But to my mind, the U.S. kept cheating and cheating because it was so damn arrogant, as the Russians kept saying, stop already, stop already, stop the NATO enlargement, stop the regime change operations, go back to nuclear arms control. The U.S. was not interested at all. In my view, from what I saw with my own eyes, the U.S. played an active role in a coup in February 2014, overthrowing the Yanukovych government. In my eyes, from my direct experience, the U.S. played an active role in torpedoing the Minsk II agreement, which was a way to have peace in Ukraine, not based on Ukraine losing its eastern Ukrainian oblasts to Russia, but rather on autonomy for those ethnically Russian regions. The U.S. didn't like that political autonomy. To my view, the U.S. torpedoed the Istanbul-based peace agreements of March and April 2022. I couldn't stand what the Biden administration was doing. This is another point I'd like to emphasize. I was a lifelong Democratic Party voter in the United States. I'm out of that now, because not only did the Democrats become warmongers, but this is not about parties. This is not about partisanship. This is about lousy foreign policy that was sustained over 30 years. And I'll just say, vis-a-vis Australia and East Asia, the United States has the propensity to create the same disaster vis-a-vis China if we're not careful. I'm hoping they won't be so stupid and they will have learned something, but Taiwan could be the Ukraine of East Asia, the same way that Ukraine became the Afghanistan of Europe. In other words, a kind of battleground in which the U.S. battles its foes, destroys the battleground country, and creates a global crisis.